Hello, welcome to the Reggie Museum and Art Gallery and our current exhibition, uh, Prairie Vernacular. You can come on in. My name is Pat Matheson. I'm one of two part-time art curators here at the museum. And over the last few weeks, my counterpart, Joanne Gruenberg, and Lynn LaCour, our education coordinator, and myself have talked about the various themes that run through this exhibition. Uh, but before I get started, I would like to acknowledge the land agreement that the museum and the land that it stands on. I'm going to have to read this to you, and loudly, because we have a train in the background, believe it or not. Uh, in the spirit of reconciliation, the MAG recognizes that this land on which we live is at the convergence of Treaty 6 territory, representing the Nahiawak, or Cree, Saulteaux, and Dene peoples, and Treaty 7 territory, representing the Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina, Kainai, and Stoney Nakoda peoples, as well as Métis people. We strive in the spirit of the treaties to keep this a place of trust, friendship, and promise. We acknowledge that promise, and we invite you to share in our respect for our future together and to move forward in a good way. Prairie Vernacular is an exhibition that was the brainchild of Jennifer McCrory, curator and director of the Musha Museum and Art Gallery, and recently retired Joanne Marion from the Medicine Hat Esplanade Arts and Heritage Center. And the title for the show comes out of the fact that most of the artists in this show are from the prairies, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba. And vernacular is a term that's been applied to art that's been created by individuals that are untrained in the arts and wouldn't normally consider themselves artists. So in the show, we have over 100 pieces of art that have been created by approximately 75 artists in all kinds of different mediums and things like that. And what's interesting about this show is we not only have what we consider folk artists, and that term goes back centuries basically, but wasn't really popularized until the late 19th century with the Dr. Henri Rousseau and his primitive or naive art. Again, untrained in the arts, formal education, those kind of things, but love to create and tell the rest of the world about their experiences in their own surroundings. The other half of the artists in this show were formally trained contemporary artists who, for whatever reason, rejected those formal art tenets and things like that, and took on some or adopted some of the materials and techniques and just the motivation behind what some of the folk artists were doing in their neighborhoods around them, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba. Some of the artists in Saskatchewan, there was Joe Fafard, Viktor Sukanski, David Thauberger, to name three, that actually they took their schooling, they went to California, went to the University of California, Davis, and met an art instructor by the name of Robert Arneson, who was actually the founder and father of what's called the funk movement. And what that was sort of a defiance of the established sort of modern art kind of tenets that were going on at the time, in particular abstract expressionism. There was an encouragement to explore new mediums, have fun with art, and be honest about what they were creating. So these artists, when they graduated, they came back to Saskatchewan and kind of started to meet and mix with local artists. And most of them would have been the folk artists from the communities that they were living in at the time, and they ended up adopting a lot of these sort of processes and the honesty that was behind, a raw expressionism that was behind a lot of the folk art at the time. So what I'm going to do is, we have two topics I'm going to talk about today. One is called The Everyday. The other one is called Memory and Memoria. And I'm going to walk through the exhibition and kind of pick up pieces and kind of talk about how they sit within those two themes. But you're going to find as I walk through these and talk about them, that there's connections and threads that go through all the other different themes and how these folk artists and contemporary artists all kind of work together on the same sort of work. And it becomes a really fascinating and fun show that way. So if you'd like, we're going to get started with the first piece here. This is called Ford by Joe Fafard. And it's a depiction of a fellow that he would have seen every morning when he went for coffee in the local coffee shop. Joe lived in Penn, Saskatchewan. That's where he first set up shop as an artist when he came back. So in this piece, it's all made out of clay, which at that time would have been considered low art because clay was normally only used for pottery and maybe for the construction of a form to cast later, things like that. And Joe kind of took it way further and did this sort of thing. You can just hear the tinkle of the spoons and the kind of banter in the background and things like that of this fellow as he sat at his booth in the restaurant cafe. So another piece, and his contemporary Viktor Sukanski also came back from Davis, and he started to work in clay and eventually bronze. And this is one of his pieces that he did. And it's called Prairie Blue and October Pickles. And his family, he was born on a farm in Saskatchewan. His family was Romanian. And this would have been part of their even survival, but daily life, daily chores on the farm, where all the harvest would have been pickled and canned and things like that after the seasons. And this is what the family would live on throughout the year. And if not for this, they'd probably starve. The blue in this thing, I think, refers to the prairie skies, the intense blue that Saskatchewan has in their skies. Another piece, very similar in some ways, but from a totally different kind of origin, is this piece here called Canning Peaches by Hazel Litgutz. And I don't know if I've got the last name properly said or not, but I hope I didn't mangle it too badly. Anyways, this is also just another scene of an everyday domestic scene. The whole family's involved. They're canning peaches. And you can kind of tell she's had some art training through the Alberta Art Gallery, I believe, back in the 40s and 50s. But she also, and that was mostly an anatomical drawing. So she didn't really learn a lot about perspective and focal points and things like that. But as an artist, she's trying to tell a story and talk about what's going on in this thing. So she's added everything, literally, to it. And from a very wonky kind of perspective, you can even see like the table, rather than for sort of fading into the background a little bit, is actually getting larger as it goes. Just little things like that that kind of set that kind of work apart from formal artists that are consciously rejecting sort of the tenets of that art form. Further on, we have some work by Alan Sapp. This one right here is called Sharpening Willow Pickets. And Alan is a really well-known First Nations artist from Red Pheasant Reserve in Saskatchewan. And this is a typical scene of just another daily sort of chore. He's making fence posts, basically, by sharpening the pickets for it. In the background is another kind of a scene going on where something's being cooked over an open fire. He was self-taught, but I'm assuming he probably took some of his cues in painting from the photographs that he took these from, because there is perspective, there's vanishing points, there's all those kind of sort of things that we recognize in fine art today as important sort of principles and elements with this. Now, I'm going to take you over to a woman by the name of Doris Zaharachuk. And she also had some training through the Alberta Art Gallery, but never really studied formal art in a lot of ways. And these two pieces, this one is called Harvesting Potatoes, and it's a scene typical of every family that lived on a farm that grew a big garden, of the days that you dug up your potatoes and cleaned them and stored them away for the fall and the winter. And then above here, she's capturing kind of a scene of a social situation for their community. And I bet you she knew everybody in this painting. I'm just guessing. But it's of a card party. And it's you could hear the conversation in the background. There's a table set up for food and refreshments, things like that. It would have been a very important sort of a social event for the community at the time. Again, these are kind of everyday scenes that they're trying to tell us about. Now, over here, we have a couple more pieces. This one is called Bull, and it's by Joe Fafard as well. Again, it's made out of clay, so at the time, kind of considered low art. But what is kind of unique about it is prior to sort of the 70s and stuff, most domestic animals you never saw in pictures, or they were just in backgrounds, things like that. Or if they were featured, they were usually featured in very dramatic, romantic kind of poses, like a charging bull or attacking lion, things like that. This is just the farm bull. He's lying down, he's probably chewing cud, just taking it easy that way. Very ordinary, very everyday kind of thing. Joe also got into printmaking, and in the 70s, printmaking was considered low art too, because it was only used for making posters and newspapers and things like that. In Manitoba and Winnipeg, I think it was called the Grand Western Canadian Print Shop opened up, and they featured artists doing original work. And Joe did this one at the time, and it's called Pieta, and it's just an ordinary cow and calf in it. Very, very domestic, very simple, very everyday kind of stuff. Another artist that also went to Davis, I mentioned his name earlier, was David Thauberger. And what he did, he also got into printmaking big time and worked with the print shop in Winnipeg. This one is kind of typical of I guess more of the folk art thing, in that there's no real perspective to this. These horses are dead on, flat in front of you. It's printmaking again, so it would be considered low art. What is unusual about this, and I don't know if I can capture it or not, if you can see the texture of the horse, he's using what's called flocking. And it's where you apply very fine particles to the surface of a print or something, and it creates a fuzzy kind of a texture. Again, considered craft work at the time, not serious fine art, but it works really well with these horses here. One other artist I'd like to show in this little room was by Janet Mitchell, and it's called And on This Farm. Janet grew up in Calgary. She worked at the Banff, I forget the hotel, a large name hotel, but she took classes when she could through the Banff School of Fine Arts. And this was back in the 40s, when a lot of the kind of well-known Canadian artists were teaching in Calgary and at the Banff School, and doing abstract expressionism and stuff. And what she's done here is kind of rejected a lot of the things that they were probably teaching. And she's kind of used some of it, though, like the perspective is really wonky. Like if you look to the left of that figure, that goose is just as large as the cow. There's no sort of shortening of space when you move into the background, things like that. But what she's portraying is basically a daily life on the farm in a joyful manner. She's using bright colors, and just the position of it is very festive in some ways. And even the subject matter, the man in the middle, is smiling quite broadly. So very fun. Now, the memory and memoria that I'm going to talk about, it could be based on personal memory, as we've sort of seen with some of these pieces already, or it could be accumulated or sort of borrowed memories from either your family, your community, your culture, things like that. And in these two cases here that I'm going to show you, this is called The Last Buffalo Hunt, and it's by Percy Two-Gun Plainwoman. And he was from the Blood Reserve, Kenai Reserve in southern Alberta. He did take some classes in Banff in his later years. But this is as I said, it's called The Last Buffalo Hunt. It shows he's got some formal sort of knowledge of perspective and placement, energy, focal points, things like that we would look at today in most art. But he was too young, maybe not even born, to have been a part of this hunt. So he's basing his memory in this on what he's been told, maybe by family, by culture, things like that. And very successful, very important kind of a painting in terms of telling something very important to his culture. Now, the next piece beside it is called, I'm going to back up a little bit to try to get it to you, called Treaty 6, Battleford Area, and it's by Henry Boudre. And Henry was the great-grandson of Powmaker, a fairly well-known peace chief from the Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. And this is the treaty signing that his grandfather would have been great-grandfather would have been a part of. So he was never there, but he probably grew up with stories in his family of this event, or I'm sure heard about it many times within his own community that way. So, and then we have, I had to show you this one. I think it's a real fun piece. This is called Rafting, and it's by Jim Carlson, who is he's untrained and very proud of it. He celebrates the fact that he has no formal art training with this. It's a fun piece. It kind of talks about probably boyhood memories. But what's kind of interesting and typical of naive or folk arts, he's tried to include everything. You have a muskrat swimming in the foreground. You've got a heron beside the raft. In the background, in the bulrushes, every bulrush head is sort of painted in, and plus there's red-winged blackbirds in it. What's kind of funky is when you look at this piece, that raft, you could be looking at it from above, from a bird's eye point of view, but Jim himself, or the subject matter on it, is sort of in the background a little bit. So it's really wonky kind of perspectives and things like that. But it shows an event that he probably remembered, and or events that he probably remembered and combined into one painting that way. Now, further on, we have a suite of paintings over here that include even some Red Deer artists. When this show was being put together, Joanne and Jennifer kind of searched out permanent art collections in other galleries, and we were able to contribute about 6 artists' works to this. And I'm going to point out 2 in this collection here. The first one being this little one down here, and it's called New Settlers to Red Deer. It's by Willard Trimble. Now, Willard Trimble would have been too young to have been part of this arrival. It's a very romantic sort of a scene, sunset in the background, mountains, and these people looking over the Red Deer Valley. I'm guessing probably this is his parents homesteaded here and helped establish Red Deer. This was maybe something that he heard about as he was growing up and was very close to as well that way. Now, another Red Deer artist was Margaret Sealy, and she was a rural school teacher. And this piece, if I can show it properly, that right there, is a monoprint. Whoop, there we go. I'm getting a shadow in there. I'm going to have to try that. There we go. Sorry to talk in the background. As a rural school teacher, she did a series of these prints later in life that depicted a Christmas pageant and the whole sort of tradition that the rural school would have done. And this one's called Santa Comes. And quite a naive, childlike, but really fun and refreshing kind of a print. Now, before we leave this series of paintings and prints and stuff, I want to point out 2 paintings that not only reject sort of some of the tenets and principles of art, but just kind of celebrate everything all together in one. And this first one is called 10 Weddings. I'll try to get down on my knees. This one here, and this one and the next one are by Hazel Litzgutz, I believe. And this one not only sort of portrays 10 weddings, things like that, but what's interesting is these 10 weddings weren't taking place simultaneously. They took place over a number of years. And if you go back into the background to the first wedding that she's painted in front of that white building, there's also a line of people heading off to your right. And that's also the storyline of her family moving from the farm and from a rural community to the larger city. So what we're looking at is it plays with perspective, it plays with time, it plays with space, she's just added everything in there. And that's often a sign of a folk artist that's wanting to tell you everything. And so they put in every little detail they can, which is kind of, in this case, I think, very fun and refreshing. The other painting she's done is called, Whitgow, something to Whitgow. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the title of it right now. But what she's done in this one is kind of shown the interiors of all the different little shops and stuff like that of that town. And where it gets kind of fun is, well, it's fun just even looking at all the different interior scenes like dioramas, but the top and bottom are really kind of refreshing in some ways, in that when you look at the front, the buildings in the foreground are very small compared to those dioramas. And then in the background, there's a dog sled that's coming up that's a monster compared to the buildings themselves and stuff. So she's really playing with different things there, but telling you a whole story about that town in one painting. Very captivating. Now, these pieces so far have all been pretty light, pretty fun, pretty narrative in sort of capturing everyday life and stuff like that. But we do also have a few darker works. This one is called Racism in Alberta in the 1940s, and it's by artist George Toska. And he was raised on a farm in Saskatchewan, was in the military for most of his life, and when he retired, he took up painting. And obviously, I guess through his travels and stuff, he noticed or saw a lot of dark things in his life. And these ones, he came back and he kind of wanted to talk about maybe the not so canning peaches and digging potatoes kind of scenes, but other things that were kind of going on. And in this one, if you look really closely, there's even signs in the window that say no Indians or dogs allowed, no Jew peddlers, things like that. There's a street fight going on with blood on the ground. There's a drunk person, all kinds of sort of ugliness that also was going on in these small towns that were just never really sort of broadcast about. He also kind of shows a naivety toward how he's painted this, in that, like the two horses that we saw in David Thauberger's piece, it's very full frontal sort of thing. There's very little perspective that goes on. He's just trying to kind of concentrate on the story that he's trying to tell that's happened in front of these buildings themselves. Next to George's work are two paintings by Viktor Sukanski's father, Frank. And Frank, as I said earlier, was Romanian, and they homesteaded in Saskatchewan. And these depict their experiences and loss of their farm in the 1930s. And he's even added little notes in there about loss of or scarcity of water, livestock dying, things like that. They're not really happy pictures in any kind of way, but he's telling us what it was like from a first-hand point of view, which is very important that way. And then two more paintings that we've got that were also by George Toska are these two. This is Dust Bowl in Saskatchewan, storms, just horrible sort of conditions, storms coming in. This one in particular is really kind of awful. It's called Mother's Day, Toby's death by a drunk driver. And if you took out sort of the front scene of carnage that took place with the drunk driver, it could make a really nice sort of all kinds of sky, little landscape buildings, things like that. But when you get up close, there's the roaring car, there's the dog that's just been hit, there's the people running to try to save the dog. A very sad event that George himself would have witnessed as a kid in this family situation growing up that way. And so now that I've totally depressed you, I wanted to end with one piece here that is really fun and very much a contrast to another bull that we've seen in the show. This is called Bull, also by artist Jane Zednick, who was formally trained. And in fact, I think, just looking at the dates that she took her studies, she probably studied under Joe Fafard at the University of Saskatchewan. He was briefly teaching there. This one has all the hallmarks of Dr. Henri Rousseau, too. It's very colorful, primitive, bright, tells stories on all kinds of levels this way. But it's also considered low art because it's made of wood and paint, and even the ring in the bull's nose, you could find at any kind of hardware store and stuff like that. So a really fun kind of a piece that I'd like to end the show with. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. This exhibition is up until August 15th, which at that time we'll have to take it down and send it back. The next show coming up is World War Women, and it starts September 3rd, I believe, and we'll have our first Friday opening on the 4th, or could be the other way around with the dates, but that'll be the next big show that's taking place in here, and come on down. But come down and see this show. We have one more week roughly of it, and it's well worth seeing. Thank you very much.